Hello, my name is Amanda Abbott, and I'd like to welcome you all to the group video for this week, featuring information about the importance of Indigenous peoples and decolonization in research methodologies. Our group will be going over information from the reading resources for this week, focusing on Decolonizing Methodologies Introduction, written by Tuiwei Smith, and an application of the two-eyed seeing, Indigenous research methods with participatory research, compiled by Cindy Pelchet. The struggle of the Indigenous peoples is not some ancient prose and obviously whitewashed textbooks. It is, unfortunately, an ongoing and contemporary concern. We can see this as recent as the New Zealand Parliament meeting on November 14th, 2024. Member of Parliament Hana Raiti Maipi Clark led a traditional haka as a protest response to a bill in session that would continue to strip away the rights of the Maori people in New Zealand. With 2020s definitely being the years of social media, she quickly went viral. In the reading excerpt of Decolonizing Methodologies, Chapter 6, The Indigenous Peoples Project, we learn more of the emergence of Maori organizations to challenge the doctrine and regulations of colonizers. This rise of Indigenous activism is not just happening in New Zealand, but also Australia, Canada, and the United States. This began in parallel to the civil rights movement and women's liberation of the 1960s. For hundreds of years, the Indigenous peoples were forced into assimilation by white colonizers, their land and children stolen, their traditions smothered and deemed punishable offenses. Through years of genocide and erasure, it is important to see what colonizers were willfully blind to. The importance of folkloric wisdom from Indigenous peoples have been squashed and kept out of the narrative as long as the colonizers have established rule on new and undiscovered lands. This brings us to the writings gathered by corresponding author Pelchet, the method of the two-eyed seeing, which focuses on creating harmony with modern participatory research and Indigenous worldviews. The article focused on Anishinaabe way of being aware of all my relations, of both physical relationships, self, and the ties to the spiritual realm from their belief system. Elder Albert Marshall explained two-eyed seeing as such: to see from one eye with the strengths of the Indigenous ways of knowing, and to see from the other eye the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and to use both eyes together. The Anishinaabe way of being reads as being similar to positionality in participatory action research, which shows that the Indigenous and Western ideals can work together if approached appropriately, which is explained in depth in the reading. The challenge, however, is showing that the research to be conducted is not on the Indigenous peoples, but with them. Many have shown skepticism because of past research conducted, but not shared with the people. Researching Indigenous people has been treated akin to observing natural wildlife, which is demeaning and, quite frankly, exhausting. My colleagues Jamie Olson, Kate Skidmore, and Carissa Ferguson will further speak specifically about colonization and the two-eyed seeing method in depth through their own interpretations. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to reading your responses from the questions available below, and we'd love to hear your own questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Carissa Ferguson. I'm really excited to be a part of the Decolonizing and Indigenous group for our action research project. I'll be bouncing off of my group member Amanda to further discuss decolonizing and Indigenous action research. My section of this presentation will focus on decolonizing, which I'll be breaking down into 4 parts: ways that Indigenized communities have been colonized in the goal of self determination, decolonizing methodologies and research structures, changes in approaches towards research to decolonize your practice, and a conclusion on what was discussed, as well as how we can participate in education structures in a way that continues to center self determination rather than participating in these white supremacy and other oppressive power structures. Additionally, it is important for me to note that Indigenous people is a flawed way to refer to many of different peoples, as people such as Maori, Aboriginals, First Nations, or people of the land, and First Peoples or Native peoples. The experiences of these different groups are vastly different, and it is inaccurate and unfair to generalize all of them within just one term. Though in my section I will be referring to them and discussing Indigenous action research under that term, it is important for me to note that work needs to be done to find a more refined way to refer to these different experiences, though they are all kind of tied in by the deep roots of colonialism. So Indigenous communities have long been a subject, never quite an active participant in research. Research is deemed a dirty word in a lot of Indigenous communities due to the extremes of suffering which has been inflicted upon them, as well as how the term research is tied directly to European imperialism and colonialism, as noted in Tuhui Smith's decolonizing methodologies and introduction. The ways in which the West historically has extracted data beneficial for the harmful power structures is based in colonialism, which entirely disregards the safety and also the legitimacy of Indigenous knowledge, and it continues to be very dehumanizing. It is critical that we continue to work on our reflexivity and learn about the history of research so that we may conduct research that's geared towards self determination and decolonization. Traditional research foundations are built on an enormous power imbalance and a lack of self reflection that is crucial in handling other communities without harm. Indigenous knowledge was considered illegitimate, and as their communities were studied, much of their culture was whitewashed and then inaccurately regurgitated back to them by the West to kind of keep them with this power structure to say, we know you, we know the experience, and we can name it, even though that's not quite accurate. Treating Indigenous folks as other isn't quite hitting the nail on the head either. We must actively pursue research regarding the Indigenous communities in a way that is totally collaborative and based in genuine efforts towards understanding their experience and demonstrating respect and really truly investing in these relationships long term with them from a place of care. Methodologies that center the legitimate knowledge of locals and all impacted by the research are productive and work towards practicing two-eyed seeing, which my other group member Jamie will be focusing on following my section. But to keep it short, two-eyed seeing is practicing utilizing the ways of knowing from both Indigenous communities and from the West at once, merging the two to create research towards inquiry that is genuinely participatory and action-based. Two-eyed seeing is an extremely important concept to put into practice as an action researcher geared towards social justice. This creates ample opportunity for self-determination and empowerment of marginalized communities. Action is key to avoiding a cold research process for participants so that real results that maximize capacity and continue towards the goal of decolonizing research can happen. Long-term sustainable social transformation can be created through these practices of practicing our critical reflexivity frequently and honestly. Centering the Indigenous communities while conducting research is a non negotiable. Politicians, bosses, investors, or any other participant that is not being directly impacted by the research cannot be centered. We must actively work towards the automatic beliefs and reactions we have and how we can work towards decolonizing spaces in general, and especially these academic spaces where research is conducted. When we think within our educational context that most of us are involved in, we must acknowledge and consider the ways that school as an institution was built upon colonialism as a foundation. So, power dynamics, racism actively impacting our students' lives, and educators who are forced oftentimes to be politically neutral are all pretty harmful ideologies that our professions are built on. When we get comfortable to take a stand and acknowledge the historical context that all of our students have been impacted by, whether in positive or negative ways in terms of who white supremacy benefits, we can work towards decentering Western views and make room for marginalized groups' powerful knowledge and voice. So today I discussed a bit of insight on how action researchers can work towards decolonizing their practice and how we as educators can continue to work towards decolonizing our classroom. I hope it was helpful to hear more about the ultimate goal of self-determination, learning about Indigenous communities this week, and I look forward to continuing this important discussion with you on decolonizing and Indigenous research. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Olson. This week's reading centered on Indigenous research methodologies, particularly Pelter's application of two-eyed seeing and the Country collective works on researching as country. These aren't simply alternative methods. They represent fundamental different epistemological frameworks that challenge core assumptions in Western research. I want to focus on what these approaches actually mean for participatory action research and why the tensions they expose matter for anyone engaging in community based work, regardless of the context. Let's start with Pelter. Pelter applied the concept of Oop Twop Tumunk, two-eyed seeing, developed by Mick Mock Elder Albert and Moderna Marshall. The framework proposes viewing research through Indigenous knowledge strengths with one eye and Western scientific strengths with the other, treating neither as superior. What makes Pelter's work significant is how this integration operates in practice. This isn't about adding Indigenous consultation to existing PAR frameworks. It's about repositioning relationability, ceremony, and Indigenous protocols as foundational methodological components rather than supplemental considerations. Here's the key shift. Western research typically positions relationships as rapport building strategies that facilitate data collection. Indigenous methodologies position relationships as the site where knowledge emerges. You cannot separate the knowledge from the relationship that produces it. This means research requires extended, ongoing reciprocity and accountability that extends well beyond publication. The implications are substantial. If knowledge relational, then concept like objectivity and rep- replicability and research neutrality, centerstones of Western research, become problematic rather than aspirational. Pelter demonstrates that Indigenous methodologies don't represent less rigorous approaches, they're different rigorous within their own standards for validity, granted in relational accountability and community benefit. The Country collective takes a more radical epistemological position. Their phrase, researching for with and as country, isn't metaphorical. In unal ontology, country encompasses land, water, plants, animals, and ancestral beings, all understood as sentimental, agental, and knowledge holding. When country is positioned as co researcher, the entire research enterprise shifts. Knowledge doesn't come primarily through interviews or observations, it emerges through singing, seasonal attention, embodied presence over years, and deep listening to what country communicates through ecological patterns, animal behaviors, and ancestral law. This represents a departure even from Pelter's integrative approach. Two-eyed seeing seeks balance between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. Bawaka Country operate predominantly within Yolnu frameworks using Western academic conventions, mainly as translation mechanisms for non-Indigenous audiences. The methodological implications are profound. If we take seriously that more than human entities hold knowledge and participate in research, how do we reconceptualize consent? How do we understand harm and benefit when our research partners include rivers and rock formations? What does reciprocity mean when your accountability not just to human communities, but to entire ecosystems? These questions push well beyond conventional research ethics, even within critical or participatory traditions. These mythologies expose several significant tensions that anyone working in this space needs to address honestly. First, structural constraints. Universities operate on semester timelines. Funding bodies demand measurable outcomes. Ethnic communities required standardized protocol. Yet, two eyed seeing and research as country requires temporal commitments that don't fit institutional rhythms. Genuine relationship building takes years, not months. Country communication according to seasonal cycles, not research schedules. So we phrase a practical question. Can these mythologies exist within institutions fundamentally shaped by colonial logic? Or does authentic implication require working outside or against institutional structures? Second, the question who can legitimately employ these frameworks? Pelter and Boald, uh, Bawaka country authors work within their communities and knowledge systems. The situation becomes more complex when non Indigenous researchers attempt to apply these mythologies.
Hi, my name is Kate Skidmore, and to summarize what was discussed in this presentation, we must consider contemporary concerns in action research and activism, no matter where. Authentic expressions of culture and self of Indigenous communities are not to be squashed out by whitewash problem solving. We must research with these communities rather than study them. We looked at ways Indigenous communities have been colonized, how decolonizing methodologies and research structures affected these people, and we look at changes in approaches to research. Most of all, how we can participate in a way to provoke change through education. It's important to view how Indigenous people have been objectified and dehumanized. Research has been deemed a dirty word by them, and I don't blame them. We must gear research back to an empowering experience and not treat them as other. Indigenous knowledge must be valued, and we should not assume. Participation in action-based research is empowering. We must keep the focus on the community being affected by the research. At the end of the day, we must ask ourselves, who is the research benefiting? By using two-eyed seeing, we can fundamentally apply that to action research and balance things out as we approach PAR. It's more than just a collection of data, but rather a production of knowledge. In a collaboration of methodologies, we're able to continue ethical standards for these communities. In the article that I read separately, there was a term that was used called Weweni, where it embodies the concept of looking after something properly. By taking on action research, we are entrusted with the ethical standard of looking after these people groups and making sure that we are Wenweni as the community in Canada had expressed during their action research. Now, moving on to our discussion questions, we pose a few questions that are going to hopefully have some critical cogs running in our brains. First question is, in what way does two-eyed seeing help to mediate conflicts that arise in research? What conflicts exist to this day when an Indigenous and Western world collide? Question number 2. Tuai Smith wrote that research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous word vocabulary due to its colonial history. If you are working with a community that held deep distrust of research, how might you rebuild trust and demonstrate accountability? And then question number 3, do you agree or disagree that educators who are not actively working to decolonize or indigenize their practices are participating in the systems of oppression? Why or why not? Please cite the reading when you give your answers, of course, and we look forward to hearing your responses. And then we did add on a bonus question. What responsibilities do non-Indigenous researchers bear when working in or with Indigenous communities? Where are the boundaries between learning from Indigenous scholarship and inappropriately claiming Indigenous frameworks? Thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.